Okay, let's get started, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Laura Maudsley, and I work as the director of the TBR Institute, which is now part of Avertech, and I'm located at Northwest Indian College in Washington State. And just to start off, I think Darren Cisco has agreed to do an opening prayer for us. I'm so grateful for that. Darren, would you like to start us off with a prayer, please?
Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
Everybody pray along with me. I'm glad to see everybody here today. Dagat chinipa da kaya she dagat chinipa atana ya tana da kusti isha da isho ni shishi tinkle. Da kaya she atle chwe has chanta is jana atle chwe da ke inchina da ke sisonia isha da isho ni stonjo ni siska isho ni shishi tinkle. Dagat chinipa da kaya she. Ni kat the des ni isha da isho tek dan katin de isho ni da chwe da atle chwe she shakunzo. Jesus, amen.
Thank you, Darren. So today we're going to talk about the provision of VR services and allowable costs, also reasonable costs and allocable costs. Our presenters today are Rachel Allen, who works as the director of the Delaware Nation Voc Rehab program, and we are lucky also to have Rachel on our faculty with the TBR Institute. And also presenting today is Beth Boland, who is the assistant director of the TBR Institute. So just directions about the chat, how to join by phone if you want to speak later when we have the Q&A. General Zoom instructions. And feel free to put a question or comment in the chat. Jamie Emmanuel is going to be monitoring the chat, and we'll also we'll stop and do questions just so they're relevant to what's being talked about at the time if we can. Otherwise, we'll have a question and answer session at the end. So these are our learning outcomes for today.
All right, so as Laura said, I'm Beth Boland, the Assistant Director for the Tribal Voc Rehab Institute. I'm currently in a hotel in DC at a conference, and so I'm hoping that the Wi-Fi stays good for my portion of this presentation. But just in case, I have Laura and Rachel who can certainly step in and help out if needed. So today we're talking about the sixth step. And so basically, you've gone through eligibility, you've gone through some assessments. Now you're ready to implement the individualized plan for employment. And so you've figured out a job goal for your participant, the services they need. And so kind of thinking about how to provide those participant VR services and kind of some things to think about. And so first and foremost, you obviously need to provide those services as described in that IPE document, or again, that individualized plan for employment. And as you know, that IPE is really to assist participants to achieve their employment goal. But we also know that we need to look at somebody in a holistic manner. And so those services on the IPE are designed to kind of think about what that person needs to achieve that employment goal. And so while everything is kind of pointed to that employment goal, we need to make sure that, transportation, childcare, other, services that they might need, continued healing of their disability, those sorts of things need to be covered in that. When you're writing those IPEs or providing these services, we also need to make sure that the services are equally accessible across your whole service area. And so kind of thinking about, making sure you have vendors or have people who can provide those services across your service area. Obviously, you also need to look for changes to services. And so we'll talk about IPE amendments in a minute, because sometimes, the best laid plans don't come to fruition, or a particular person that you're using for a service isn't available, or someone new comes in that person wants to use. And so kind of constantly managing those need for changes. You also might need to diagnose or help treat impairments that come up during the service provision. And obviously job search, job placement, on the job supports. And so that's, a big part of providing these services is to help that person in those job search. And, counseling and guidance. And so as a rehabilitation counselor, this I think is sometimes something that we don't think about, but every single IPE should include counseling and guidance as that service, because we are the ones in the position of helping that person continue to understand their disability, continue on that job search, continue to participate in the community the best that they can and the way that they want to. And a lot of that is through that counseling and guidance. One of the things that I talk to my students about is thinking about counseling in a voc rehab kind of a way. And so as voc rehab professionals, we don't provide kind of what you might think of long-term, lifelong, weekly sessions, for instance, that maybe a mental health counselor would provide. Our counseling and guidance is really targeted towards helping that person reach their employment goal, working on adjustment to disability issues, continuing that healing process, becoming more of a member of their tribal community if that's something that they want to do. And so our counseling is short-term, goal-oriented, but still very important and very impactful. And so I just want you to not miss that, as you're working with somebody. And obviously providing any employment goods or services. And then if there's any training, so if it's on the job training or short-term certification type training or longer term, associate degree, bachelor degree sorts of training, kind of thinking about those services. So yeah, go ahead, Laura, thanks. So if we think about this provision of services, it's often helpful to have a checklist or kind of this list of things that you want to make sure that you're doing. And I think beginning counselors can really be helpful for them if they have some sort of a cheat sheet that they can use to make sure that they're doing everything that they need to as they're providing these services. It's also helpful for directors to also kind of think of this checklist, because as you're reviewing cases, then you can help your counselors make sure that these things are happening. And so documentation is important. And so you'll see that throughout this presentation is documentation. So noting start dates and completion dates of all the services in that IPE. If your project policy is requiring some sort of demonstration of economic need prior to service, make sure that that's verified and documented. Throughout the provision of services, you need to maintain contact with that participant. And so doing good case noting is very important so that you know when you contacted that person, what you talked about, and kind of what the next steps might be. You also want to make sure that participants are engaged in their improved service, engaged in trying to figure out that employment outcome or meeting those employment outcome needs. And it's really important, I think, at the outset of the relationship to make sure that that person knows that they are in the driver's seat. They are the ones that should be participating in the services, going forward with that employment outcome, and that if that stops, you may have to discontinue their services. And so it's really important for them to make sure that they're in contact with you, that if you reach out to say, hey, I haven't heard from you in a couple months, what's going on, that they respond and get back to you. And then also part of this provision of services is looking at comparable benefits. So as we know, the Voc Rehab program cannot provide every single service that somebody needs. And so making sure that you are talking to your participants about these comparable benefits. And so, for instance, like Pell Grants, if they're in school, or other sorts of scholarships. If they're a veteran, are they accessing those VA benefits? Workers' compensation, if that person disability was a result of being injured on the job, and any other kind of childcare benefits, unemployment benefits. And so working through with that person to make sure that there are comparable services that are looked at, comparable benefits, but then also documenting that, because that's something that RSA is going to be looking for and that we need to make sure we're documenting. As I said, case notes, documentation is really important. And so as you're providing these services, making sure that it's documented, that you are following through, or that person is following through on whatever you ask them to do. And really important throughout the whole case is informed choice, but really important when it comes to this provision of services. So we know that the participants who are receiving our Voc Rehab services need to make sure that there is choice. So they have choice in the services. This is their life. While we might be coming in as somewhat experts about certain people to use or certain routes to go, we want to make sure that you're case noting when you gave that person choice. Informed choice means that you provided them with enough information that they could make a really well-founded choice with that. And so you want to document that. Obviously, recording outcomes of goods and services in the case note. This is also helpful as you continue to work with other participants. And so if you know a particular person who you had somebody get a service from and they provided it really well, or it was somewhat lacking, this is also helpful as you're recording this and documenting it, so that the next person coming in, you may have maybe slightly different information to give to that participant around choice. If things have changed, so if services have changed, if job goal has changed, you might need to amend the IPE. So we're going to look at that in a minute. But just know that that is possible because a lot of times things change. And then obviously you need to authorize payment for goods and services per your own project policy, maybe your travel policy and procedures. So just want to take a pause. I don't see any questions in the chat, but any questions about the provision of services on the original IPE? So Bettina put in the chat, if they refuse to use programs or agencies that can pay or help finance their IPE steps and goals, does VR pay for everything? So Laura or Rachel, I think you're maybe in a better position to answer that question. I believe the answer would be yes, but I'm not exactly confident.
I think one of the main things is to show you don't have to always secure those comparable benefits, but show that you are exploring them and seeking them. And sometimes the consumer's informed choice can certainly come into play, and there might be really valid reasons why they're not comfortable using particular vendors, especially if you live in a small area. And so the main thing generally is to show that you've explored those and that they have been considered.
Right.
Laura, did you have more?
No, I think that covers it. Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I think one thing, though, to pay attention to is just the cost of those services. And like Jamie said, yeah, you must exhaust all reasonable choices for benefits, making sure that you do not pay for a resource that's already available or being used by the consumer. So you know your budget, it gets stretched thin if you're providing a lot of services to people. And so really that's a big reason why the comparable benefits comes in, to make sure that you have enough funds to serve everyone who is eligible for your program. And so that's where it's helpful. But yes, sometimes people have valid reasons for not wanting to use a particular program or agency. Thank you, Bettina. So thinking about an IPE amendment. So you already have that individualized plan for employment in place, and then things change. And so you need to do an IPE amendment if the participant's employment goal has changed, the services to be provided have changed, the vendor has changed for an identified service. And this kind of goes back to Bettina's question. So, if you had identified a vendor for that service, and then after some careful thinking and some more information, that participant decides to not use that vendor, then you need to go in and do that amendment. There might be an extension in completion dates. Again, best laid plans, and things might take longer. There might be a disruption because of change in disability condition or worsening of that disability. There might have been a death in the family or a tribal commitment that then just extended those dates. And so, that can call for an IPE amendment. Changing costs for services, change in status of the case, or a change in the participant's disability condition. And in particular, sometimes what happens after you start an IPE is that there might be an additional disability, or through some diagnosis, they have come up, decided or found out that they have another disability identified. So if that disability condition changes, you want to revisit that IPE, because they may need different services or additional services, different accommodations. Maybe the job goal isn't appropriate anymore. And so any of these sorts of things that happen, you need to then amend that IPE. Next slide. So thinking about amending an IPE, again, the provisions need to be made with this informed choice. And so as a counselor, you do not amend an IPE without the participant agreeing to it and going through an informed choice process. And so again, if there's any additional new services or those extensions or anything else, including comparable services and benefits, that informed choice has to be taken into account. And amendments do not take effect until they're fully signed, which means that they're signed by the participant and or their authorized representative, the VR counselor and or the director. And so once you have all those signatures, you want to make sure you provide a copy of the amendment IPE to the participant. You also want to retain the original copy of the approved IPE as well as the amendment in the case record. And so thinking about informed choice in particular, making sure to document that there was an informed choice process in any modifications to the employment goal and any selection of those revised service providers, the extension of dates, the responsibilities of you as the rehab counselor or project, the participant in any of these third-party agencies. Then, like I said, once it's the final approval means that there's all signatures to that. And so you want to, in addition to retaining those copies, you want to document the date and purpose of the IPE amendment in the case notes. So it's very clear about the reasons why you went through that IPE amendment process. Next slide. So the ABRTAC website has some really good resources about the provision of services when you're looking at activities, resources, particular forms. And so, I encourage you to look at the AVERTAC website for all of the steps in the VR process. There's some really good information there. So thinking about a list of services. So sometimes somebody really doesn't know what's available. And so when you think about informed choice of a participant, they may not know the traditional healing services that you can provide, for instance, or that you can help with transportation and things like that. There's some great documents available that kind of take you from intake to post-employment. So looking at that whole spectrum of services, looking at some specifics about the IPE amendment, closure for non-employment reasons, those sorts of things. And so I just encourage you to look at the AVERTAC website for these great resources. So any questions about IPE amendments or IPE in general? Okay, I'm not seeing any, and of course you can pop them in the chat while we're going. So next slide, please. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, and she is going to talk about allowable, allocable, and I forgot the other A, I'm sorry.
Reasonable.
Cost. Reasonable, it's not an A, that's why I couldn't think of it. Reasonable cost, because when providing these services that we just talked about through the IPE, you need to make sure that your project funds are spent properly. And a lot of this is documentation, but it's also understanding the federal regulations. And so Rachel will cover the federal regulations and guidance for spending grant funds, the criteria, when to seek prior approval, and then some considerations for procuring goods and services. So Rachel.
Thank you. Welcome everyone. And I do want to say that I have had years as a counselor prior to being a director, and I'm actually not here representing the current project that I work for, but just as a Northwest Indian College instructor, and just the basic experience that I've had as a counselor and a director, but I'm not representing any of those projects at this time during this presentation. And so we want to get into the specific CFRs that you can refer to and help to discuss and better understand what some of those entail. And so the reference for our cost principles, our discussion of allowable costs and reasonable and allocable, is found in the uniform guidance of the 2 CFR section 200 subpart E, entitled cost principles. And that includes sections 200.400 through 200.475. And the allowable costs for TVR agencies specifically are detailed in 34 CFR section 371.41, which includes guidance on the purchase of culturally relevant services. And over the years, we've had some different references for some of our services and the guidance that's available. And so we have to refer to the most recent because there have been changes, and as far as where other sections are referred to in previous versions might not line up now. And so we have to make sure that we are addressing the most recent guidance for our project specifically. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So also known as the U.S. Office of Management and Budget's Uniform Administration Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards, or sometimes we talk about the OMB. The uniform guidance again is that 2 CFR section 200. And what these do is they synthesize and supersede guidance from earlier OMB, what were called circulars. There used to be some individual ones that applied to our program that were called circulars. And the uniform guidance is now like one big major document that covers more than just specific programs or just a list of specific programs. And this supersedes even EDGAR, Part 74 and 80. As some of you know, we have multiple types of guidance and multiple sources for guidance, and some hold priority over the others. It also removes previous conflicting guidance between different documents and establishes standard language. Different documents had different terms, and that made it confusing, or they would word things in different phrases that were talking about the same thing but didn't explain it in the same way. So this uniform guidance helped to try to bring that together and make it more clear for our guidance. Directs the focus of audits to areas that have been identified as at risk for waste, fraud, and abuse. It lays the groundwork for federal agencies to standardize data processing. The guidance clarifies and updates cost reporting guidelines for award recipients. And the link is available here for the online version, and everyone will be able to access the slides at a later date. And this is a live link, but being in the webinar, you can't necessarily click on it. I don't know if we're going to be putting the live links in the chat or not throughout the presentation, but you will be able to access the recording afterward, where you can pause it, and also I believe you'll get a copy of the slides, and it will be on the website as well.
So Rachel, this is Beth. Paula has a question in the chat. Can these references be found on each program's grant award notification or GAN?
I believe that we get different attachments. I don't know if every program receives the same attachments. If anybody does know, definitely chime in. When you get your grant award notification packet, it often has, multiple sections after just what we traditionally refer to as the GAN, that front page. And so I don't actually know if all of those can be found in your GAN packet for everybody, if it's consistent. Does anybody else know that would like to chime in the chat box on that? That's a great question. I never actually thought of if we all have that in each of our packets.
I think we do. I just can't look at it right now. So
right, we can check into that, and maybe in the follow-up email it can be included
sure.
as an answer to that question. Go ahead, Jamie.
Sorry, I meant to raise my hand. I'm writing this down because questions that we have about this, we'll present to RSA and see if we can get an answer from them. And then once we do, we'll report it out to everyone. Great question, Paula.
This is Paula. I think it was a rhetorical question. I think that both of these can be found in our GANs, and I'm just pointing that out for program managers, because this is also included in our GANs. Maybe not the website, but just linking it to practice, I guess. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Paula. I was wondering if it was a rhetorical question or not. So thanks.
All right, I think we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So first, we're going to discuss allowable costs. And again, as Beth referred to the three different types that we're going to discuss: allowable, reasonable, and allocable. First, we're going to talk about the allowable. So in addition to those allowable costs established in 2 CFR section 200.400 through 0.475, the following items are also allowable costs under the AVERS programs. 1, expenditures for provision of VR services for the administration, including staff development of a program of VR services. 2, expenditures for services reflecting the cultural background of the American Indians being served, including treatment provided by Native healing practitioners who are recognized as such by the VR program, the tribal VR program, when the services are necessary to assist an individual with disabilities to achieve his or her VR objective. And so if you notice, there are certain areas that emphasis has been added for your reference. For instance, on number 2, it may look very different program to program or project to project, who might be recognized and how that process is determined, how that can look. In some areas, there might be limited number of native healing practitioners, and what that looks like might be very different than in another part of the country or even another part of the state, and what would be appropriate for that particular project. Some of our projects only serve that particular tribe that's the grantee, or maybe certain ones that are in the geographical area, or maybe historically that are tied to that particular grantee as far as the tribe. And some of our projects serve all federally recognized tribes. So what that's going to look like in terms of finding and recognizing as an appropriate traditional healer for your participants might look very different project to project. And if you notice that in a different color and underlined, it's as determined by the tribal VR program. So not an outside agency that would be determining that. We don't have necessarily healers that maybe are board certified or go through some state kind of testing to say that they have these letters behind their name that they can, some other individual or entity has determined that they are appropriate to provide those services. So just know that that looks different program to program often. And then B, expenditures may not be made under this project or program to cover the costs of providing VR services to individuals with disabilities not residing on or near federal or state reservations. And in your grant proposal, that service area should be laid out as far as, again, it might look very different from one program to another, what's considered on or near their reservation. So that if you don't know what your service area is or the specifics of it, you know, some just do a radius around their tribal land, some do it based on counties, some do it, you know, much more broad description and area for their service area. So it should be laid out in your proposal to RSA for your grant application. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So it's the responsibility of the TBR project to ensure that all expenditures made with grant funds are allowable, allocable, and reasonable. And the general criteria and guidelines for allowable costs are in 2 CFR section 200.403. Reasonable costs are costs that do not exceed what a reasonable person would pay for an item or service in a typical circumstance, as listed in 2 CFR section 200.404. And allocable costs are those that can be charged to the TBR project's grant award as described in 2 CFR section 200.405. So for reasonable, one thing to take into consideration is it may vary quite a bit, again, over the course of, or over the span of the United States, for instance. What is very reasonable for something such as transportation in California is going to look very different than what might be reasonable, maybe dollar-wise, for somebody in Louisiana. And they might both be going to school, or they might both be going for disability management, but it's going to look different based on fuel costs, how far they might have to travel to seek those services. And for instance, in Alaska, I don't know who we have on from Alaska, but they might speak to that at a later time if they so choose. But for instance, a plane might need to be secured, a plane ride, and that it's going to cost a lot different for somebody to go for an evaluation perhaps, or for to attend a disability management appointment versus somebody who might be able to just drive for an hour away and to seek those services. So reasonable is going to look very different depending on the circumstances and where you are. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So general information about allowable costs. They need to be necessary and reasonable for the performance of the TBR project. They need to conform to any limitations or exclusions in the categories listed in 2 CFR section 200.400 through 0.475. They need to be consistent with the project's policies and procedures. They need to be consistent in use and categorization across the project. They cannot be used for match for other federal programs, and the costs need to require complete documentation and justification. And participant costs should directly relate to the determination of eligibility or the required services, such as in an IPE or post-employment services plan. And they need to be necessary to obtain an employment outcome that is consistent with their abilities, capabilities, priorities. And it can't be that they have things that they're requesting and that the program is providing that aren't related to those items and those the needs for the employment outcome. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. So allowable costs specific to TVR include expenditures for the delivery of the TVR services, expenditures for administration and management, expenditures for staff development, expenditures for culturally appropriate VR services, as well as for transition services for those programs that do provide it, although it cannot be for pre-employment transition services. Generally, that's done through your partnership with the state, if you have one, and each state is required to allocate a certain amount of percentage to provide those for those that are eligible in their state. And so if that's something that is needed in your area and your program is seeking those for your community, and it might be another program that is doing that and through the school systems, but sometimes VR is involved as well as another partnering agency, then we encourage you to keep developing and fostering those relationships, but our services are not able to provide the pre-eds. Okay, go ahead to the next slide, please. So on to reasonable. Again, it must not exceed what a reasonable or sensible person would pay for that particular service or item. And the circumstances must be considered at the time that the decision was made to incur the cost. You know, again, over time, what may be, I'll use transportation again, what may have been reasonable 10 years ago compared to now, even in the same geographical area, might not be the same thing. And same thing with maybe certain trainings, certain tuition hikes that have gone on over the years. Looking back at an older case versus a case now, a lot more dollars, a higher dollar value would probably be tied to that expenditure now versus some time ago. So it relates to what the situation is at the time in that particular area. And also sometimes one person going to school, depending on what supportive services that they need for that, two different participants going to even the same school might cost a very different amount. You know, one person might need to repeat some classes, maybe because of their disability, they had some setbacks, maybe they need special equipment. And for the other person, maybe they didn't need special equipment. So even if the tuition might look very similar for two people, the additional services needed to support that goal, that employment goal and the training that's required for them to get from point A to point B, the cost might be very different participant to participant, even if you're comparing, well, they both went to this particular school or this particular training. The costs should reflect market prices for comparable goods in the area. You know, you can't go with a vendor that charges thousands of dollars more than a comparable vendor in the area. Reasonable costs are recognized as ordinary and or necessary for TVR operation. Reasonable costs do not violate tribal, state, or federal laws. And costs are considered reasonable if they do not significantly deviate from the established project practices and policies. Okay, go ahead and go to the next slide. Jamie said, yes, price of gas. I see in the chat box. So on to allocable. So a cost is allocable to a TVR agency if the goods or services involved are chargeable and assignable to the TVR agency's grant award. So these have to be costs that are incurred specifically for the TVR project. They can't be costs that another program within the tribe actually incurred. They need to be necessary for the overall operation of the TVR project or the provision of participant services. And they must be distributed proportionately across programs or departments if it's a shared cost. Costs that are identified as indirect costs are not allocable as direct costs. So it might vary program to program, tribe to tribe, and it might vary even over the years if something is considered indirect versus direct. Like maybe the tribe decided to start picking up everybody's internet costs and it becomes an indirect cost, but it used to be a direct cost for your project, for instance. But the point being that they can't be charged to both indirect and direct at the same time. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So there are some expenditures over the course of the grant cycles that you might need to get prior approval for. And guidance regarding that can be found in 2 CFR section 200.407. So there might be times when you're wondering, should I get prior approval? Should I not get prior approval? And if you're unsure, then it's encouraged that you go ahead and get with your project officer. And they might say, no, we're okay with you moving forward with that. Based on this information that you've shared, we don't need to have written correspondence about it with the details. And we say, yes, go ahead with that. So when concerned about the allowability of a cost or whether a cost exceeds what may commonly be considered reasonable, check with your project officer. And then it may take some more information. They may say, yes, I want to know more about the details. Can you give me maybe some quotes, or can you explain more so I best understand what the purpose is of this particular service or this particular expenditure that you're looking to get. But that's the best bet, is to work it out with them, and they can tell you if you need to get further information and get official approval from them. And it is just considered a best practice, and to have that communication with your project officer, because you don't want to run the chance of having to pay those funds back later. That can put a hold on things for some things in the future. It can be difficult to explain that to the tribe as far as why you're having to pay back some funds. So it's just good to have that working relationship as best you can with your project officer to be in the clear and avoid that. We can go to the next slide. So here's some considerations for procurement. Following the project's policies and procedures. And if you need to update yours, if you need to, maybe you're a new director and you're just getting them established, or a number of different situations, AverTech has assistance for that. They have technical assistance. I believe there's some older webinars also that you might refer to the recordings for policies and procedures guidance. So if that's something that you need to update or look into, then there are those resources with AverTech. Spending time with your finance office staff. Some projects might have it called the business office. And then you also might have a procurement department as well. So you might need to meet with both your finance office and your procurement officer if they're not considered under one umbrella within the tribe. And describe VR and help them to understand the types of purchases the project may make for participants, especially if there's turnover, if there are new people that have come in since the last time you might have done that, or if you've never done that. Sometimes that can clear up some confusion and avoid maybe some misunderstandings. For instance, if you are paying for training, for tuition, maybe the higher ed department has a different line item for that they submit to finance, and you don't want your finance department perhaps trying to change your line item and say, oh, well, this is tuition just like it is for higher ed. You might have a different designation for that within your budget and how that's broken down in your budget. So being on the same page about those types of things. Same thing for, you might have 3 different kinds of transportation that you provide, and maybe you code those differently. So maybe a checklist that you share with them on how you determine which way you code it, for instance. Those kinds of things can be worked out easily and avoid confusion. And maybe you didn't realize that they were changing it in their system because your requisition still showed the code that you intended to use, but then you notice when you get budget reports that you have less money in a certain line item than you have in your records. And it could be something like that they thought they were helping and correcting something when really that's not how you intended for it to be spent or out of that particular line item. So having those discussions can really help to avoid or correct things like that may have been happening. Developing a process to protect participant confidentiality when payments are processed by finance or when ordering items with vendors. You might have different processes for that. And sometimes we have participant IDs that are to protect that information. And if the finance department says, well, we need that invoice, we need the original, they actually don't. I mean, if they're trying to insist on that, then I would really try to work together with them to explain how our projects have to protect that confidentiality, and we are not to turn in any identifying information where they could see the participant's name, their address, their date of birth, social security number, account number for different accounts that they may have that we may be paying, like a charge for. Maybe they needed a cell phone bill assistance to help with job search or to help with their training, to help with a number of things where we might be assisting them with that as a service in their IPE. They don't need to know that phone number or that account. They might say, well, we want to just call and pay for that over the phone, and so we need their account number. Can you go ahead and give that to us? We can't do that. We have to protect the participants' confidentiality. So explaining that ahead of time instead of when something's maybe trying to be rushed, or you know, there can be that miscommunication there, and they think that we're just trying to be difficult. By them knowing what our guidance is from RSA and them understanding the importance of us maintaining that confidentiality ahead of time, they can work together as our partner and best serve our participants. So developing those processes can help avoid some of those hiccups you might have. Give participants as much choice as possible when choosing vendors for goods and services. Again, depending on your geographic area and the types of services that you have in your immediate area, that can be more challenging for certain services. A limited number of vendors can definitely make that a little bit harder, but as much as possible, you know, there's that informed choice, letting them know who, if you have a process for the tribe to approve new vendors, letting them know, you know, that these are the approved vendors we already have. And if you need another vendor, realize that might take a little more time, but we can try to get those other vendors on our approved vendor list so that you can access the one that you feel most comfortable with or is going to work out the best for you. Follow federal procurement standards, and that's in 2 CFR 200.317 through 200.327, and tribal requirements for quotes and sole source expenditures. And that may be within your tribal organization. You might have to get a certain number of quotes if the service is a certain dollar amount. And then again, you have to check if your policies and procedures align with that. If you say that you have to get quotes within your policies and procedures, if it's a higher number, a higher dollar amount, if the tribe's finance department or the procurement office says it's a lower dollar amount that you have to get quotes with, then you need to, you know, work together on that and see if that's something that you would want to lower in your policy and procedure, or you want to make sure that you're adhering to the tribe's requirements as well. And then ensuring that expenditures for participant services are properly documented and justified. I think I saw a question pop up in the chat. Let me see, it's kind of scrolling, but I think the question had been, finance does not need the name of the consumer and what the PO service is for. So the name, no, they do not need the name. You might be able to work out a system where you have basically just need to give them as the minimum amount of information they need to carry that out on behalf of the tribal VR program. And others can jump in as well. I see that some examples are given of which ID number or how they develop the ID number to turn in. But even if the tribe is receiving an audit, unless it's the RSA auditor specifically for the tribal VR, even the auditors don't need to see that. There should be the links, the paper trail that shows, okay, this specific ID number does go to this specific case, but that's only for the tribal VR staff and team to be able to make that link together. They do need to know up to a point of what it's for, but minimal information to carry out that. And that's where you can sit down with your whether it be tribal administration that helps with that facilitation with the finance office, but where you can together determine, well, what's the minimal amount of information they need to carry that duty out for the project, and only include that. It might just be saying that transportation, and then say the vendor, and say maybe if they do it for a period of time and the amount, basically. Other projects might have different guidelines for that, or their finance department might have different guidance for what's the minimum amount, but the name should not be included. That's breaking confidentiality. Go ahead.
Yeah, and Rachel, this is Beth. I'm also just wondering if you're getting a lot of pushback. Is this something that you could ask your RSA project officer to be part of that conversation so that they can represent the RSA side of things?
And RSA has provided some written guidance on
Mhm.
that. They have provided letters over the years, and they have updated that letter, I want to say just about 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. And so if that's something that you need a copy of, then either I would check with, and I'm sorry, it's already scrolled so far past, I don't even see who had asked that, but either the on the 121 directors listserv that's sometimes shared from time to time, and maybe one of the directors can share that after this webinar, and or contact your project officer for a copy of that. Again, when there's been turnover within agencies, sometimes that is not reshared when new people come on board, and you might not have access to that readily. But reach out to another director, for instance. I don't even know if it was a director that asked it, I'm sorry. But reach out to either your own director if you're not the director, or reach out to another director or on the listserv, and that letter can be sent out again. Did anybody else have any input on
Yeah,
that? Go ahead.
I was just going to move on to another question. So that's
Okay, sure.
so. Michael Heron just asked, what if client fraud has taken place and the tribe is pursuing repayment?
That I know some projects have had some experience with and have shared those experiences. And I think some of that will depend on your tribe's process, but I would certainly ask your RSA project officer for guidance on that, because they should be able to offer you, as far as the confidentiality part, they should be able to offer you guidance on that. I know that can be a difficult situation to be in, and I don't want to give any incorrect information on that, but I would definitely try to get your RSA officer's input on that, on how to best handle that with the tribe cohesively. Beth, do you have anything else, or Laura, on that one?
Nope, that's all I would say as well. Just use your project officer to help with these things.
Yeah, that is a sticky situation to be in. I feel for you. Okay.
Rachel, there's also a question about confidentiality in an auditing situation.
Okay, so what RSA has shared with us in the past, when I say us, they're from time to time, the used to be monthly meetings, and sometimes it's quarterly meetings, and it's varied over the years. And even though it's a director's teleconference or Zoom meeting or something of that nature, over the years it's changed. Even as a counselor, I was very lucky to be able to sit in on those, and thankful it helped me quite a bit, even as a counselor, to better understand things. And my understanding from over the years and the guidance from RSA was that you can work out a system with the auditors and the tribe to, for instance, get ahead of time a list of the cases that they want to review, find out what specifically that they want to review, and then you don't just hand over those files. You have a process that you figure out together, that can be where a staff member, a team member from the TBR project, usually the director, but it may be somebody else assigned, an assistant director, or maybe a lead counselor, a seasoned team member, maybe that is assigned that duty, that they would be there and show the items that are needed within the case file, but with you can cover, you can provide copies where those things have been blacked out or whited out, for instance, and they just see the necessary relevant information. Like just sometimes they're looking for, does the case file, and it varies what your auditors are going to look for sometimes, but does the case file document that this person has a signed application, that their disability was determined, and is the check request process documented in there, those kinds of things. And you can show those copies or even the originals with those specific identifying bits of information covered. So you can see that, yes, this person has, if you do a certificate of eligibility, for instance, you can cover their name and the other things at the top maybe of that form, but you can see that there's a description and you can see the date that the counselor or the director signed off saying, yes, I verify this person is eligible, but without the auditor seeing the actual name or date of birth or whatever you might have on there. But if an RSA auditor is to visit a project, then they do have access to those items.
So Rachel, there's another question just about how much detail you need to provide. So there was an example, a PO for clothing. Should we itemize the items or just provide a general description?
That can vary what your project has determined in your policies and procedures, and along with the finance officer and office, what they require. I don't know that very many itemize it on the information that they turn into their finance department, but it can be itemized within the IPE and or the narratives, because you need to discuss, for instance, if they need certain kind of shoes, you would want that to be included in the narratives, how that determination was made. And for instance, if they need non-slip, non-skid black shoes, because that's what their employer requires, generally you would have that list of the uniform or the requirements from the employer in the case file. And you might include that in your PO process, but without that person's name and maybe not even with the employer's name, but you would have it in your case file. And I have heard of some projects where they've had pushback from their finance department or others that are signing off on purchases that say, we don't understand why they need undergarments. You know, that's not a requirement of work really, but there might be, you know, if they don't have them, then are they going to be able to carry out their duties at work? Some jobs do require, for instance, ladies to wear hose. They have to only wear skirts and they have to wear hose. Or if they're working in an office setting and they have to have open-toed, or they have open-toed shoes, some places say you have to wear hose. Well, if somebody is not able to go purchase those items, is that going to be what keeps them from going on that interview or being able to pass inspection after their first few days of work? And so those can be items those are allowable expenses if that's what's required for that person to work. And you should work that out with your finance department of, if you can just say they need clothing up to $250, or if you do have to itemize them. But it's not an overall requirement across the board, for instance, that everybody has to do that. That's going to vary tribe to tribe and project to project.
And Meredith has her hand up raised.
Go ahead.
Good morning, Rachel. Are
Morning.
you able to hear me?
Mhm.
Yeah, I had a question in regards to services for individuals who been through the program more than once within several years.
Mhm.
And each time they're requesting a certain service, for example, a cell phone. Is that something, and I do understand the cell phone is needed for job search, or, you know, is that something we have to provide each time, or is that, because, you know, when you mentioned earlier about exhausting or, you know, funds towards something that we've already provided in the past, although it's a new case.
Mhm. In that instance, I would probably have a discussion of what happened to the other ones you provided. Where did they go?
Mhm.
Why are they no longer able to fulfill their need? I would look into comparable benefits and see, is that something that is needed at that time? Are they able to to seek that employment goal without it, or looking for another resource for it. And that might be something that if it's not in your policies and procedures, that might be something that you consider adding in the future of, we cannot do certain services over and over. You know, there might be a period of time that you say has to pass before something is provided again, but always with that that assurance of, there might be certain circumstances that we break our own, not break, but, you know, we extend that policy and go ahead and do it if there is a circumstance that allows for that, or that warrants that. It might be that we have, the counselor can't authorize it, but then the director can under certain circumstances. It is a little more tricky when it's already been a closed case and it's a reopened case. And so you might put that in your policies and procedures that in one instance, if it's still an open case, you might only do it every so often. But if it's a newly open case, then it might be different. But yeah, that's something that as a project that I would think that you would kind of hash out and develop those guidelines.
Thank you.
You're
I
welcome.
did have another question.
Okay.
Nobody else does. It's in regards to purchasing laptops for individuals that are going to be going to school or in school now. For procurement process, because right now I don't believe it's in our policy that we have to go through the tribal procurement process, but are we allowed to provide direct payment for them to go to their vendor to purchase their laptop and provide receipts?
My understanding at this time is that that is discouraged.
Okay.
I know that a lot of states do that. And my understanding is for tribal VRs that we still are not able to do reimbursements or direct payment. And somebody please correct me if you have heard otherwise from RSA, but that's my understanding. And I haven't been in that situation. I have not done that in any time recently at all or anything. And so that's not something that I've continued to stay. I haven't heard anything new about it, but if new information came out about that, then since I don't do that anyway, then I haven't retained that information. I can't recall hearing anything different.
Okay.
Does anybody else, has anybody heard that we can do direct payment? Because I have not. Okay, Lakota said the same thing. Okay.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, this is Beth, I'm just wondering if there's a big cost difference though, because sometimes students can get a cheaper computer than maybe you as an agency. I would just again reach out to your project officer to ask that, but
Yeah, I know in the past when similar situation, they did go through the procurement office when they purchased over $1,000 laptop where, you know, you could purchase it at Walmart or somewhere cheaper for $500 to $800. So that was my question, you know, as far as when you're looking at your budgeting and, you know, where you want to spend your monies and in that situation.
And that might be something that you can discuss with procurement and say, look, we anticipate maybe next semester we have 4 or 5 that we think that we might want to purchase. Can we figure out a better way than how it's been being done? You know, maybe they don't realize that big cost difference for your program. That's a lot, you know, that adds up over time. And maybe they can look at how they've been securing them and change that perhaps.
Thank you. I do have another question. It's kind of new. It's a new situation. I have an individual who's doing online schooling and does culinary work, but their school is like 500 miles away. So online, they do provide their ingredients and assignments that they have to go purchase. I mean, not purchase, but pick up at the school. And my individual just told me that they're now riding a bus once every other week, a Greyhound bus, to go pick up his assignments. And I just thought, oh my God, I didn't know that. You know, first off, I was surprised, but how, you know, transportation service is that an allowable to be able to purchase that? And I am in the process of trying to see if we can do a transport
Mhm.
from our program.
I would check with the school to see if comparable items could be purchased locally. You maybe get that list ahead of time and work with them on securing that locally if possible, if that's allowable, is one option. And then, like you said, the program transporting perhaps. But I think still even the bus ride, I think would be an allowable, because that's a requirement. If it's a requirement of their training program for them to come in person and pick those items up, which I can't imagine they're the only one in that situation that's taking the class from a distance. Maybe other students already have a secured permission to purchase them locally. But if all else fails, if it is still required to go there personally and pick them up, I would think that you could put that in an IPE as a requirement, get that documentation from the training program, and that it would be able to be put in the IPE as a service required of their training.
Thank you.
That's what my take is, Beth.
Oh, yep. There's just another question about laptop. Does purchasing a laptop fall within prior approval for equipment? And is this both client or just for program use?
That also might vary tribe to tribe what is required, and then and it depends on the cost for sure. You know, some equipment's going to be quite costly and some might be minimal. But I honestly, I'm trying to think as far as what's categorized as equipment, and I would have to go back and review my notes on that.
Yeah, generally speaking, equipment, at least in the past, RSA guidance has been $5,000 and above as equipment, and things under that, but that number may have changed. But in RSA grants that I've administered, a laptop usually falls below that, so it's considered supplies and not equipment. But again, you know, that's something that you'd want to double check with
your project officer.
I would think it would also depend on whether it's in the grant, written into the grant, or it's something that has come up as a need as you're going along.
And kind of showing that need as well. So some people, it's easier to show an IPE need for a laptop versus someone else.
I think with so much distance learning that has been available to our participants the last few years, and as time goes on, I think that's just going to increase anyway. You know, laptops that are a reasonable amount. You don't, there's that analogy of you can't always buy a Cadillac when a Pinto is going to do the job, right? So depending on the type of laptop, and if they need special software and things of that nature that goes for specific training programs, or because of the accommodations that they might need, then that can get more costly. But I think the general run-of-the-mill, low-cost one, you know, you can put that in an IPE without concern, because they're not usually super high dollar. But definitely you can, if you have a specific situation that you're worried about or just wondering about, then I would check with your project officer on that. But yeah, I think Amanda had put in some info.
Some info.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Amanda. And how are we doing on time? Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, we have 15 minutes, so.
Okay.
There's just one other question.
Okay.
Yeah, there's one more question that maybe we should move on. So what if a service is or can be provided by another consumer that is in that 90-day countdown? I'm assuming employment countdown. How would that work?
That can get tricky as far as confidentiality sometimes. And making sure that I would see, it depends possibly what other vendors would be available, and making sure there's not conflict of interest if it's avoidable, and seeing what informed choice for that consumer would be. We wouldn't want to be in a situation where we're saying, hey, let's try this vendor. They happen to be a consumer, so we want to help their business out, kind of thing. But sharing options with the participant on what vendors are available. I don't see a problem, of course, having current participants or previous participants on our vendor list. We want to encourage their business and especially in limited areas where they might be the only one that can provide that particular service. So it wouldn't make sense to have your participant travel 100 miles to get the service when it is available right there locally, just because it happens to be from a current or previous consumer or participant. So it would depend on those types of things of what other vendors are available in the area. How is confidentiality for both parties being protected when possible? They may already know that each other is a participant. And so just making sure to be cognizant of those things. Especially in small communities, I'm sure it happens frequently. So it's not that I'm aware of that anybody would say that that's not allowable. Just making sure to take into consideration that it's informed choice, what other vendors are available, and the confidentiality. Is there anything else that you can think of, Beth, on that, or Laura? Okay. And I didn't even see that question, so did I answer all the parts of it? Okay. All righty, if anything else pops up, let me know. And I think we are on maybe we're the second to the last bullet there of making sure to follow the procedures for the sole expenditures and quotes. And then, oh no, I did say the documentation for and justification for those expenditures. So I think we're ready to go to the next slide.
And we do have one other question for allowable if we have time, but I know
Okay.
basically about trying to get a tool for staff to use in this remote environment. And is that okay based on allowable costs? And so they're working with their IT department. So it seems like it is if you can justify that that's related to providing services.
Looks like it was a tool. It's a tool for consumer data.
Consumer data. So maybe like a
Mhm.
database.
Yeah, because it was currently done manually before. It says,
Oh. Yeah, and depending on the cost of that, for sure, you might need to get with your project officer, because the costs of those can vary greatly. And sometimes it's more of an upfront cost and then maybe a monthly or annual cost. And some of them, you don't have that big upfront cost. So that might be something, I mean, it's allowable to have those types of tools if that's what the general question is, but depending on the cost, it might be something. And if you don't already have it in your budget, if that wasn't anticipated as a need when you wrote your proposal, your 5-year grant proposal, if you didn't have it in there, then I would discuss it with your project officer as well. Okay. Let's see. I'm scrolling through the chat to see if we answered.
yeah, so I had a message is sent to me directly, but I think others might want to know. So just wondering if they can get a copy of the PowerPoint or slides. And so I believe that they'll be available on the AverTech website. I'm not sure, Jamie, if they get emailed, or Laura, if you know.
Jamie gave the thumbs up.
So AverTech website.
Yeah, there'll be a follow-up email after
perfect.
today's presentation with the link to the recording and then also link to the materials and a survey. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Hey, Philip, they want you to spin the wheel.
I'm a
Philip's coworker was able to fix him up with a virtual background. So, Philip, can you hear us? Oh, he doesn't have his headphones on.
There we go.
Philip, they're wanting you to spin the wheel.
Oh, it's frozen place. No way to spin it.
Oh no.
Yeah,
Sorry, Laquita, you're out of luck.
yeah.
That's great.
Well,
I
are there
just want
any?
to thank
Oh.
everyone. I want to thank Rachel Allen, Dr. Beth Boland, Laura Mopsy, everyone with the Institute for providing today's presentation and information. I think I've learned a lot, and I hope that everyone else has also. And we can hang around for a little while if anyone else has any additional questions. Yes, Amanda, CRC credits are available. Just send me your, if you'll email me your request, we'll get it to you.
Thank you, everyone, for the great questions too.
Mhm.